This is the streaming service that Mike has used for, well, you can see with the backdrop there, it's like the Bieber's 50th anniversary bash.
Oh, yeah.
So this is the streaming service for that. And I apologize, I'm horribly backlit. That's a south-facing window, and the sun is just streaming through it right now. So, but not on video, so it doesn't matter. At least this isn't going to get released as the video part. We're just recording the audio.
Sure, no problem at all.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Scouting Stuff, the Scouting Stuff podcast. You've got two of us again today. I continue to be Scouter Ken, and at the other end of the internet is none other than Mr. Liam Burns. Hello.
Hi, Ken. Delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, brilliant. And I'm sure a lot of people in Scouts Canada already know who you are, but just in case, why don't you give us like the very quick penny tour? Liam Burns, you are the CEO of Scouts Canada now, but who are you, sir?
That's right, Ken. I started with Scouts Canada back in May 2023, so it's about the year and a half mark at this point. Before that, I worked for the Scout Association in the UK for about just shy of 10 years. I started off in their government affairs team, and then over time sort of collected a different hodgepodge of different roles, eventually becoming Chief Programme Officer, so looked after the programme itself, as well as our fundraising from things like government and foundations and corporate partners, our diversity, equity and inclusion efforts, and strategic planning and reporting. So a mixture of different things. Before that, I was involved in student politics. So I, both locally and then eventually in elected roles nationally, in a more campaigning role, a more advocacy role. And I guess part of the journey into professional scouting, because I was a young person in scouting from 6, which at the time was the youngest you could be involved in the movement back then, right through to being a volunteer with the equivalent of events. But when I worked for the National Union of Students, the chief executive of the time got the job as chief executive of Scouts UK. And then a position came up in their government affairs team, so I moved across. So, scouting's been a constant theme in my life since being a beaver.
Well, I have a similar story. That's really, really awesome. And I think you're maybe down. At least I wasn't necessarily aware of you as the person behind a lot of these roles, but I was certainly very excited to see Squirrel Scouts come on board. And I gather that you were fairly instrumental in bringing that to fruition.
Well, there was loads of people involved, not least hundreds of volunteers that took part in piloting early years scouting from the start, when we started with a very clear assertion that this was about, is early years scouting appropriate or not? It certainly wasn't a fait accompli. But yeah, I led the staff team and worked with the lead volunteer to try and pull together that research, external funding, the pilots, and eventually the evaluation that led the UK to decide this is something that we wanted to scale up. And I think at this point, I might have my numbers slightly up, but I think they're up to something like 1,600 drays. So that is tens of thousands of young people now doing scouting who weren't before. With lots of exciting other bits and bobs that we've found along the way. So really interesting that a lot of the volunteers who started had never had anything to do with scouting. And a lot of the anecdotes saying, well, look, the threshold for how difficult this appears to a volunteer is much lower. So interesting stuff that they tried with family scouting that I'm not quite sure panned out, but they tried different formats where things like older siblings could stay. It ended up being far more accessible for things like single parent families. A lot more interaction with grandparents, interestingly. So lots and lots of benefits that came from it. Sure, some things that didn't work out as well. But yeah, I was there for most of the journey to being able to say, yes, this is something we wanted to do in the UK.
Oh, brilliant. I remember covering that in the little news bits that I do on the podcast. And that was...
I remember listening.
That's really, really exciting. That's, a thing that's happening. And at the time I had a 3-year-old. It's it'd be nice if we had something like that here. But now he's 7 as a beaver. So,
it's particularly relevant in a Canadian context when sort of access to the great outdoors is kind of culturally imbibed in in you from such a young age. And I mean, look, it was exciting. As we're experiencing here, it's a bit, I'm going to use a UK term that probably no one will get, but it's a bit like Marmite. Do you have Marmite over here? I don't even know if you've got it, but it's basically this peanut jelly type thing that people either love or hate. And that's a bit what early years was when we started. There was lots of people who, like you, kind of said, look, I can completely see the developmental opportunities, the impact it can have on young people, sort of people understanding that the waiting lists are already full of young people who might want to join at an earlier age. But for sure, there was lots of people who said, I think this is just childcare with a different name. I'm worried about whether or not at that age you can actually take part in non-formal education. Like, can you do teamwork? Can you do leadership? Can you make choices and take responsibility? Right through to the basics that I've definitely seen come through already of, well, are they all going to wet themselves? And I'm going to have to deal with that. So, I mean, one of the things we're trying to land, which we haven't got quite right from the start, but we're trying to land now as we do think about, is early year scouting appropriate in Canada or not, is to stay in that objective place, because there might be reasons why it's not. And so that at least the first 24 months has got to answer that question before we get close to saying, is this something that we want to scale?
Well, it's something we can watch for in the future. Yeah, maybe it'll work like you, maybe it won't, like you say. But yeah, you're right. It's not something that we can just dive into. But I just, looking back over like the history of scouting, it's just, we started with, I mean, at the very, very beginning, it was scouts. And then Cub Scouts came along because, of course, scouts usually had younger siblings and they were also showing up. So then, a program was built for them. Fast forward, another not quite half century. And first kind of in like Ireland and then a bit in the UK and then in a major way in Canada, the same thing was happening now for the Cub Scouts. So beavers, or, that got exported around the world under a few different names. And now again with squirrels. And it's just, it's the natural progression of, I think how scouting just tries to encompass more and more youth, or at least be open to encompassing more and more youth, which is awesome.
Well, I think it was Baden Powell who said we're a movement because we keep on moving. So for sure, we've got to do some thought leadership on this stuff. I mean, you referenced there Northern Ireland. The history of this is interesting in the UK in that beaver scouting was actually done in Northern Ireland for years before it was accepted as legitimate in the UK in about 1984, I think it was. And then, as you say, there was I don't think the UK was the first to do it, but certainly there was an export of that concept. It was exactly the same with squirrels. That has been running in Northern Ireland for over a decade before. And interestingly, the UK actually looked at it about 10 years ago and said, no, this is not for us. So it kind of ran under the radar as a separate thing that looked almost identical to scouting for a good 10 years before there was a political opening to reconsider it again. And I think down to all of the volunteers that really played with it, piloted well, said what worked, said what didn't, it became blindingly obvious that this was a good thing. And I think the thing I'd return to on, if someone said, why should we even consider it? Like, I don't like the concept, I don't agree with it, why would you even spend the time looking at it? Well, all of the science shows that the types of activities you take part in through non-formal education, and certainly in that context, scouting, has a disproportionate impact on the life outcomes of young people. So I'm not even just talking about the in-the-moment development. There is loads of science on the sort of the neurological development of young people that shows if you have these language-rich environments, if you're exposed to new settings and cultures, if you are given moments of making decisions and developing your functional executive skills, that you'll have better life outcomes. And that's what we're here to do. So, look, we might well conclude there is something about a Canadian context that says, either scouting or otherwise, that says early year scouting isn't right for us. But I'd make no apology for saying that we should look at it for that specific reason.
Absolutely. Well, that is a fascinating intro to a completely different topic. Because, although in a way it is related, because one of the things that you've been doing, especially lately, is putting out a lot of these, I guess you could call them like executive leadership blog posts, where you really are sort of taking those first steps to have the discussions that need to happen before you can make any of those big changes. And the one that precipitated us ultimately ending up on the calendar here was your blog post from, I want to say July, but don't quote, yes, July 7th, called Badge of Honor, where you offered some thoughts on the badge framework that we use now under, well, what used to be called Canadian Path, not so much anymore, although that terminology is still around, but it's now just, understood to be like the Scouts Canada badge program, which, for those listening, maybe newer to the podcast, I know I've talked about this stuff in the past. The badge program that we use in Scouts Canada is based on the World Organization's one program model. And I remember, back when we first started doing this, and even back when I first started the podcast, I was having a lot of conversations with Scouts out of Ireland because they had already adopted that model, and there was a direct overlap between their outdoor adventure skills badges and ours. The exact topical categories were a bit different because obviously, I think one of theirs was something to do with flight, which we don't have, but then we have winter skills because Canada. And so your post was, and I think it spoke to a lot of to a lot of what people have been feeling about the badge program. And I've been of two minds about it as well, because on the one hand, I like the outdoor adventure skills. I like them a lot. And I like the way that they have been incorporated into the progression model for a Scout. You have to, if you want to get your top section award, part of what that entails is having earned a set number of outdoor adventure skills, whatever the numbers are. It varies by section, goes up by section. But you have to earn your outdoor adventure skills. And there's other stuff too, service project and all the review stuff. So that part's been really, really great. But equally, the personal achievement badges, which broadly speaking replaced a lot of the merit badges that we would have had under the old program, have not really taken off, I think, the way that the framers of Canadian Path hoped they would. And that was, I think, really what your post was about. I'm trying to find there's one full quote here. I think just quoting from the article here, I think the almost wholesale removal of an underpinning badge framework for scouting in Canada was a mistake. I think the lack of such scaffolding makes planning much more difficult, as it is not as reliable a way of giving young people genuine agency as we might hope. But I also don't think that the two are mutually exclusive. A decade on since the launch of the Canadian Path, the time is right for a review. And I don't disagree with anything in that little excerpt right there. I think it was, like you say, time for a bit of a review about the badge program that came into being under Canadian Path, to look at the parts of it that really work and to look at the parts of it that don't work. And like I say, my own ear to the ground has been that the outdoor adventure skills have mostly done well, but the personal achievement badges have almost completely fallen off. And even in my own sections, it's really, really hard to get the youth to buy into them. And so what even we wind up doing is we don't really even pitch them to the youth as an individual project at all. But if we can map a sequence of meetings to a particular badge, then, as long as you're at, say, for Beavers, it was 3 adventures for a personal achievement badge. So if we have 3 meetings that are all on some topic that falls under one of those personal achievement headers, and you make it to all 3 of those meetings, well, cool, here's your personal achievement badge, which is maybe not the best way to do it. But then equally, I don't know what the best way to do it would be. And I guess, what I wanted to maybe invite you on to talk about was just to get to dig a little bit deeper into your thinking there. And I have my own thoughts about where I'd like to see the badge program go. But I kind of wanted to see if there was an opportunity to capture some of your thoughts about in an ideal sense, what are some things that you would like to see? What are some strengths that you see in the Canadian Path badge program? And, what are some things where you're like, yes, this needs to change?
Sure. Let me start with a caveat. First of all, say I'm not currently volunteering, so I'm not delivering a program. So all I say comes with a heavy caveat that other people know better than me. And so anything we go into is going to have to be something that's co-designed with young people and section volunteers in particular. But for sure, I can share my kind of 10 cents worth. Let's start with the strengths. I think that the focus on outcomes for young people, which is really well embedded into the Canadian path, is deeply impressive and not to be taken for granted. And I say that because I don't think many NSOs take it for granted that that's unfair. They implicitly accept that what we do is meant to lead to better outcomes for young people, but we don't talk about it in that sense. And I think that's because people are a little bit scared of sounding too much like school or too much like formal education. And so almost instinctively reject the idea that we'd start by talking about outcomes for young people rather than necessarily the activity that they undertake. And I think the Canadian path was trying to speak to that. It was trying to say that actually the forefront of a section volunteer's mind should be, what is it you're trying to develop the young person in? I think plan, do, review, again, it might not feel revolutionary in the context of what good youth work looks like. But again, I think in a UK context, we did a piece of work to create what we internally called a theory of change, not a scouting thing. Like it comes from, it started in the 1980s with international NGOs and then proliferated through the non-profit sector. But it basically tries to describe what is it you're trying to ultimately achieve, what kind of short-term things need to change to achieve that goal, and what do you need to be able to get to those short-term changes. And when we did it, and this is a little bit what it's like in Canada, when we tried to say, how do we talk about our program at the moment? How do we explain it to a volunteer? There was all sorts of different ways, all layered one on top of another, of explaining it. You start from the premise of the law and the promise. You had some articulation of the pedagogy. In Canada, they've taken much more of the sort of the World Scouting articulation of that, using spiritual, physical, intellectual, character, etc. Spices, exactly, spices. And then things happen over the years, right? Things get layered on top where, and usually when a new regime of volunteers come in and they want to create and improve and move on the program, but you just ended up with this layering and complexity that, with the best will in the world, nobody on the ground was getting these things explained to them because it was always just too much for a time-poor youth worker. So, but in amongst all of that, there was actually no reference to, once you've done an activity, you should stop and ask young people what worked, what didn't, what would you do next time, what did you feel yourself, and what do you think you'd do different? And this is a very basic tenet of good youth work, but in the UK, it was not referenced anywhere. And so the fact that Canada has plan, do, review as probably one of the only elements of the Canadian path that I could have confidence a volunteer would repeat back at me is impressive. You've referenced the outdoor skills. There's a lot of love for that. There is some criticism that I get, particularly from young people, along the lines of some of these feel nigh on impossible to get to the top of. And a little bit of
level 9 stuff is pretty intense, some of it.
Yeah, and it's a little bit of that. Anyway, but nonetheless, the sort of prominence of outdoor educational skills is something to be celebrated. If I go to my critique, now whether there is outdoor adventure, OAS, whether there is personal achievement, the actual structure of it, I've got views, but they're pretty heavily biased by what I've known in the UK, right? So I tend to not go into that too much. What I do assert is, if we are going to get more volunteers, then we have to consider them not only coming from a scouting pedigree, coming right through the program and deciding they're going to do it, and the over-reliance in a Canadian context. I have no evidence to back this up, but anecdotally, I think Canada disproportionately relies on parents and carers of kids currently in a section. And that introduces all sorts of vulnerabilities because they time out. You lose the volunteers when their kid moves on or decides not to be part of scouting. And I think there is a longevity challenge to that. Building institutional capacity for a more sophisticated program becomes difficult. So that's not to say we shouldn't do more of it. But how are we going to get someone who doesn't have kids, full stop, but doesn't have kids in the program to want to volunteer as part of a children's charity? How are you going to get students with more time to decide to give their time to this? How are you going to get people who've retired to be able to come and be section volunteers? The only way they're going to do it is if they think they can do it. And the only way you do that is if there's a simplicity to what they're doing. And I guess my other assertion is like I wouldn't do this job if I didn't think the type of non-formal education we deliver is special and powerful and in many regards unique. But it ain't rocket science.
Hmm.
And I think sometimes we, in scouting, in a really sort of well-intended way to wanting to improve what we do that thing I refer to of layering on more and more guidance, instruction, structure, that you eventually get to the point where someone says, look, I've got an hour to plan this, I've got a couple of hours to turn up and deliver it. I don't have time to try and understand, hang on, the spices connect to which program areas and what is that in terms of OAS badges, and like that, they just don't have the capacity for it. So I guess my main argument in that blog was I think there are some things that we should be really proud of. The youth-shaped nature of it, so I should have referenced that. So that this kind of laser focus on young people should decide, which I do then go on to critique. And nonetheless, I think that is a good thing in and of itself. There are stuff that we should be proud of, but is there a way to boil this down? And yes, I, again, biased because I've only ever known the UK programme, albeit I've seen other member organisations of the World Scouting and what they do. I think the badge framework it works. It gives you like a vehicle to try and plan your program around. And I know we tried that. I've spoken to people about, well, how, do you use the program map? And usually what they do is they say, sure, it's pinned on that board over there. Like that's the extent to which the program map is used. And I just think we've got to make it easier for people to plan great balanced programs. And in my mind, the badge framework, at least for the younger sections, is an obvious way of doing that. Now, none of this answers the older sections. It's interesting. We started talking about early years. One of the things that I understand why people get skeptical about early year scouting is often they'd say, well, hang on, we're not doing nearly enough for the older sections, which I do understand. And it's a challenging one because as much as I believe there is untold potential in helping young people at those important life transition moments, it is also the minority of our movement. And so if you get down to quite a hard-nosed analysis of what the charity is trying to achieve, then there is a logical argument to say, well, you've got to get the thing right that reaches most young people. But I don't suggest that badge frameworks in and of themselves would answer some of our concerns about a waning membership number in Vents and Rovers, for instance. And I think the last thing I'd say is one of the criticisms I understand from the Canadian Path Consultation and Design was that the problem with a badge framework is you end up with volunteers, very understandably, basically coming up with a 2-3 year program that they can wheel out every time. People refer to the fact there's filofaxes of
just repeating the same stuff.
Week 3 will do that, and like that's not youth shaped. And never mind, that's not a kind of a newfangled thing. Like we are about getting young people to make choices and take responsibility. And if they're not doing that in the program they take part in, then actually that's a failing of the pedagogy. It's not just a nice thing to do. So I understand why people worry. And the other concern is if you have a badge that sits for 10 years, it becomes irrelevant. I remember in the UK, we went back to our communications badge, and in it had the requirement for a cub to use the yellow pages, which you did have over here, right?
We did. Actually, the yellow pages still exist because the yellow pages were the business listings. So they still kind of exist. We
in paper format.
We also have the white pages, which were like home phone numbers.
Sure, if we're in the business, though, of Skills for Life, Ken, which person in this day and age is going to go and look up a paper book for a business?
Nobody. My phone book is Google Maps or Apple Maps.
Exactly. So there's a danger that the badge is just sit and gather dust. And so the trick is that my view, you want a badge framework that's fairly agile and is never left to sort of gather dust and is co-designed with young people, has requirements that are based on outcomes, not just the first ideas of activities that comes to your head. That's where I take it. But my premise is certainly, and I think the blog got enough positive response for me to be fairly confident in this now, that there is an appetite to revisit what we've got at the moment. And I would be astounded if that didn't make it into our next strategic plan.
Excellent. You've touched on the concept of youth led, and of course, that's a huge thing in Scouts Canada's whole mentality and how we try to operate the program. But I think, and I know I've talked about like my group on the podcast a fair bit, but like just thinking over like just the history I've had with the group since, like I'm with the same group that I was in Beavers with. Now I'm a leader for it. Now my youngest is a Beaver for the same group. My eldest is a Venturer. When she started as a Beaver, that was right when Canadian Path was launching. I inherited the Beaver colony because all the Beaver Scouters wanted to move up to other sections where their kids had moved on to. And it was an interesting case study in where youth-led absolutely can succeed and where youth-led absolutely falls on its face. And the personal achievement badges and how we do them is the latter. It, in theory, is supposed to give the youth maximum initiative to set their own requirements and choose their own goals and get rewarded for that. And nobody cares to do that. But at the same time, when I sat a bunch of Beavers down and they're like, and it's like, okay, well, what would you like to do in meetings? Because the world's kind of our oyster here. We don't really have anything holding us back except for certain safety rules, no archery at that age level, for one example. What do you want to do? And they just peppered us with ideas. And then we spent the rest of the year basically just trying to execute on all of them. Outdoor stuff that was indoors, so they wanted to go on hikes. They wanted to go snowshoeing. They wanted to go on camps, overnight camps, which, another thing that happened around the same time as of Canadian Path was that this requirement that had been in place for years to have Beavers always be accompanied by a parent on an overnight trip, that got dropped. And I mean, that was game changing. It's absolute game changing. So we had tons of camps with them. But then at the same time, you have these kids like, well, we want to talk to an astronaut. We want to design a board game. It's like, I don't know how to do any of that, but I will darn well do what I can to make it happen. And turns out it's actually really hard to get an interview with NASA astronauts, but people who've been to space privately are not under the same restrictions as NASA employees are. So we did actually have a chat with somebody who had been to space privately and had done experiments on the space station. So that was fun. We ultimately did actually figure out how to design board games with the Beavers. And that was, those were all points where youth-led was just like wildly successful for us. But the personal achievement badges completely just fell flat. The outdoor adventure skills, though, have tended to be a pretty big hit. And I think the difference, you mentioned like the communications badge. And yes, okay, having to look up something in the Yellow Page is definitely an outdated requirement. But then equally, when you have a badge that has, say, a checklist of 6 items that, you have to complete, well, those 6 items can be, buckets. So instead of, look up in the Yellow Pages how to get in touch with the business, you can, rework that to just be like, demonstrate a method of finding a way to contact a business, right? And that becomes broader in that, so now you're not beholden to this 1980s style of looking up phone numbers. You can just go to Google Maps. But the point is you can show that. But I think it just helps to have, and where the OAS succeeds, is it helps to have sort of those checklist of requirements that someone can actually like have in front of them. They can even just print it off and have it on a piece of paper in front of them. We had books, like in Cubs, in Scouts. We actually had books with all the different badge requirements and little checklists that you can go through. As long as those categories are not, so hyper focused that you're having to revise them every 5 years to keep them, relevant to current technology or what have you. As long as the requirements are a little bit sufficiently generic or broad that they can map to, the changing technological or cultural context, I think that works well because, the youth don't really want to spend all their time, I don't think, thinking up, well, what do I want to do for my next badge necessarily.
Even to leaders.
Neither do the leaders.
And this is the point. I slightly disagree with you, Ken, in that this is the tension, right? And it's a perfectly logical one. You try and come up. Do you try and come up with, and whether it's badges or some other bit of scaffolding around the program, do you try and come up with something that you think is future-proofed for 10 years? I'm sorry, but I don't think anything is future-proof for 10 years.
Oh, goodness, no. No.
And so the bit that you sacrifice in doing that is the specificity that makes a volunteer's life easier. And I suppose, I actually subscribe more to the lean into the specificity, but come up with a way that you can be constantly agile in saying, requirements will move on. We'll learn. The idea that we would create something that would last for 10 years when there's, thousands of volunteers seeing it on the ground and knowing what works and what doesn't, and we're not feeding that back into changes, would be ridiculous. But it is actually how a lot of member organisations, National Scout organisations work. And let me go back to you had a few points in there, I think. The way that I think about Youth Shaped is I break it into two different buckets. You've got Youth Shaped in the sense of young people are delivering the programme. And that's traditionally what I think Scouting at its best has always done. So, how do you the patrol system was always about that. The idea that you've got people slightly more senior who are delivering and taking responsibility for the other young people. Not as tangible a program in Canada, but we can have 14 to 17-year-olds who go and volunteer in Beavers and Cubs, and they can deliver the program. And at its best, they are delivering the program, not just making cups of tea for the adults, right? So there's something about the delivery of program that we should always try and do as much of as possible. The other element is then more about power and influence. And that's the bit that I think is a bit generational, right? I think there's just something that we'd have said 30 years ago that people didn't even think young people should have voice and agency, spoke when spoken to, etc., etc. And then the world moves on. And actually, I think Canada should be really proud of where they've got to in terms of things like the Key 3 model. Is that on steroids, right? If done properly, that's meant to be that the young person in that triad has as much power as anyone else. Like in terms of the way that I work with Stephen, our National Commissioner, and Justin, our National Youth Commissioner, like they often overrule me. I often lose arguments, and vice versa. And that is a really powerful form of power and agency. But it's a little bit more unusual, and it's a little bit newer, I think, to Scouting, thinking about it in that sense. That other countries do it much, much better, but as they do delivery of programme, like if you look at, I always get this wrong, it's definitely Nordic countries, but I might end up quoting the wrong ones, but there is definitely countries where it's almost unheard of for a section volunteer to be older than 25. Almost unheard of. In fact, some of them it says you can't. And so the sort of I'll get in trouble if I'm not careful here, but the equivalence of your sort of long tenured volunteers in a Canadian context in these countries are no older than 35. So there are definitely models out there that look slightly different to us. The only other thing I'd say that I think is a tension is when we talk about young people shaping their program, and you spoke about the fact some do really well, some fall flat in their face. That's because it's hard. So that act of being able to say to a group of young people, what do you want to do? And not just let it be, I don't know, go bowling, go to the cinema. So you've instantly got a coaching role to try and say, well, actually, and that's what the idea of what the program map we talked about was meant to try and do. But how do you have a conversation that says, well, in terms of if you wanted to develop your leadership or if you want to try and do something that's more adventurous, what do you want to do, etc. And then the other skill you've got to have, and you did a great example, is some beaver saying, I want to go to space. Now, instead of just being able to say, well, we can't do that, so what else do you want to do? Like, I've absolutely seen volunteers say, okay, and then arrange to go and see a local air base, or arrange to, go to a local company that's involved in aeronautic manufacturing of some description. Like, there's ways that you can interpret it. Another story I got was a kid who went, I want to go skydiving like a beaver. They couldn't do that, but they could absolutely go to the local gymnasium and set up like a short fall and get someone who knows the parts of a parachute to come in and talk about it. But that takes time, and it's not easy. And I'm not saying we should always run to the lowest common denominator on the knowledge our volunteers have, but you do have to accept that. I use this analogy, and I think it's a bit of a rubbish analogy, but I often when I'm talking to new colleagues, particularly if they're from out with Scouting, I say, look, one of the things you've got to remember is Scouting is a little bit, what I say is you've got to be careful that you don't try and play a high resolution movie on a Game Boy.
Oh yeah, use that in examples there.
There is a threshold over which you can get as clever as you like. With the best will in the world, a local volunteer who could be coming from any walk of life, who only has a few hours a week to be able to give, is not going to engage with your super sophisticated and complex program initiative. And so you've got to accept that there's a threshold you've got to come under. So, I mean, and that's my point on Youth Shaped. I worry that by trying in the search for something that is young people are completely in charge and make all of the calls and have all of the answers. The danger is if you can't do it properly, you end up with something that is far worse than, do you know what, guys? Actually, we are going to do a hike, but I'm going to let you guys organize it, right? That introduces lots of responsibility and decision making. Did the idea come from a young person? Maybe not. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. It's really interesting. There's a cultural tension in Scouts Canada just now where I think really good thinking that said we need to get to more consistency. We need to get to where a young person in Manitoba has the same experience as a young person in Ottawa. And no one ever said that meant they're doing the same thing on the same night in the same week. That was never what someone said. But there was and it still is. There's a desire to say, our program is what technically you'd call low fidelity. Like you can't guarantee what a young person takes part in, how much dosage they get, i.e. how much of that activity do they get, when do they get it. You just can't. That's not our model. But there's a desire to have more of it, more fidelity. And I think that needs a debate. And the example I'd give is, sometimes we get really hung up on the idea that someone doesn't follow the Canadian path. And what I'm not talking about is our safety standards and policies, of which there's utterly an expectation that they will be followed.
Of course.
But do I care if you're not doing the OAS badges? Well, maybe I do if objectively you look at the program and go, you're playing soccer on a Wednesday night every week. That's not scouting. Or right. You've only got 8 young people with the best will in the world. You're not doing teamwork and peer leadership. But do I care? Like someone put it to me the other week. A past example of apparently someone was like buying in program badges from another country, and I was a bit like, do we care? Like if they're doing non-formal education, do we really care? And look, that might be quite naive, and it might take you down a road of losing all cohesion around the program in a really problematic way. So I'm not saying I'm right, but I do think there's something about having a simpler scaffolding where we can be guaranteed that the right things are definitely happening and understood, and then holding the rest of it a little lighter. But because I think that's the only way that our model can work when we rely on thousands of volunteers, time-poor volunteers, to be able to make this work on the ground.
I don't disagree. And a lot of it does. And, it's funny because, just again, watching, I've been very fortunate with the group that I'm with, we've, a lot of the kids that are in the Venturer company now, we have 25, 28 Venturers, which is, I can't even imagine that. That's never been my experience of what the Venturer program looks like. And yet here we are. But a lot of the kids that are there, are kids that I've seen move up through the program as Beavers and then onto Cubs and onto Scouts. And they're in it for life, more or less. And you're exactly right in that, it's not the badges themselves that are bringing them in. It's the community that they're finding there. It is the challenge because they do like to, throw themselves a good challenge, whether that's, a weekend camp where we're actually doing rock climbing, whether that's, hike, whether that's whatever. But it's also, the community aspect of it. We had built out a beautiful tech backend before COVID hit. So when the need to go virtual happened, it was just, okay, well, next week we're online. We already have the infrastructure in place to do it. Let's just do it. And that's another place where there was a lot of reticence and pushback, right? Because no, there should be no technology in scouting. It's like, okay, well, what are you going to do? Shut down for a year and a half? Some groups made that choice. Ours did not. And do I think that helped us come out of the pandemic, come out of the time when we couldn't be in person with stronger numbers, stronger sense of community, sort of retaining people in the group that we otherwise would have seen drift away? Absolutely. I think that was instrumental in it. And yeah, towards the end, we were definitely chomping at the bit to get back to in person because we were straining for ideas for what was going to keep things going virtually. But if we hadn't taken that step, and it was really, it was continuing the community. And as much as possible, yeah, we can put challenges to the youth that they can try and do at home, but it was continuing that sense of community. There's that. Some of the best friendships I have in life came out of scouting. Some of the best friendships I see forming in my kids' life, in the life of other kids in my section, are through scouting. And I'd be lying if I said that. That's probably the biggest reason most of them keep coming back, is just because they're there with their buddies. It's immensely supportive. And yeah, they do some pretty fun stuff that they don't necessarily do anywhere else.
Well, and that last sentence you just said for me is the key. And, how do you, and if we're talking about attention, I'll move on from this, but if we're talking about attention with Youth Shape, I think that's my premise is the search for trying to do like real agency and power at the extreme end can only be done actually with a lot of confidence, a lot of skill, and a lot of time. And that's not to say that means it shouldn't happen. But I think you've got to have a safety net that says if you don't have that confidence, skill, or time, what comes instead? And I just look, if you run a program that says you will do this and it's the same thing I dust off every year and you have no choice, I just suspect that young people will vote with their feet. They're just not going to come back, right? I doubt if you had a program that says, look, we're a bit more hands-on with, we're definitely going to be doing a hike this weekend. It's in the diary. We're doing a camp this weekend. We are going to go and do this community project. But building the opportunity for shaping that for responsibility, like who's booking the campsite, like who's sorting out the transport rota, who's doing this. Yep. I would much rather that happened and accept that, sure, maybe the idea didn't come wholesale from young people, than languishing in a space. And I hear it, particularly at the Vents and Rovers, I definitely hear people say, like, I asked them what they wanted to do, they didn't have any ideas. What do you want me to do now? And so that's, I think your point on, I think if you have a program that is genuinely doing things that are fun, challenging, and new, like to an extent, there's nowhere else you're going to get to do this. And I don't mean that's because you're going, skydiving. I mean, it's because you're doing it in a way that is like, oh, like I'm in charge of this game. Like, oh, I'm responsible for making sure these 6 other people get through this night hike. Like that stuff that doesn't happen anywhere. It just doesn't happen anywhere else. I don't
Not
believe
really.
It does. Then I think you'll have a great program. I mean, on your point about COVID, I mean, when I started in May and I landed in Vancouver and travelled east for about 6 weeks before getting actually into the game. I was very lucky that Andrew Price, the past chief commissioner, was like incredibly generous with being able to hold the fort, etc., while I had some time to settle in. So as I did that journey, one of my kind of template questions for young people was, why are you still here? Like we've gone through, and actually because Canada felt to me about 12 months behind where the UK felt in terms of the doors being back open. There was still quite a lot of intrepidation. There was quite a lot of, I saw lots of volunteers meet each other and going, oh, I've not seen you in ages. So it felt a little bit behind. It felt more raw, more recent.
Varied by province, but yeah.
Yeah, okay, interesting. I mean, I got that sense whenever I went, but maybe it was just the people I met. And what I asked young people as a standard question was, why are you still here? Like, how did we manage to keep you through COVID? And interestingly, the Beavers and the Rovers would say specifics like, I want to do camping, I want to do hikes, I want to do this thing. Cub Scouts and Vents were actually a little bit more sophisticated. And almost every single time they talked about friendship, they talked about contact, they talked about relationships. They might not have used those words, but certainly things like, I wanted to see people outside of school. Like, I wanted to have friends from outside my town. Like, it was all about the contact with people. So again, like that's why, and I think at some point we've got to deal with this. That's why, we sit at the moment with about 30% of our sections holding only 12 places available in My Scouts. I get it. I get it from a confidence point of view. I get it from just like it's easier to manage. I don't think it's scouting, because I don't think you've got a critical volume to allow for that peer leadership and teamwork to really emerge. And I think we will have to deal with that at some point. Like, I honestly don't know why we wouldn't say, look, what's minimum ratio? What does that equate to a number of places? That will be the number of places open in your group. But as you know, we have bigger fish to fry in registration processes and mechanisms, so I ain't going there yet.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm with you on that because, I mean, I've been on both sides of the ratio issue because, the second year that I was a Beaver Scouter, we were incredibly lean for volunteers. Because again, all the people who've been doing it for years moved on. One guy stayed behind, and then it was just me. And so, I mean, we only have 8, like you have 2. Well, okay, you're capped at a certain number, and that's just what your number is. Now, we went right to the wall on that number, but we also decided, well, you know what, to heck with it. Like, we're constrained as we are, but we have 16 kids, and they're willing to show up every week. So let's just run with this thing with whatever crazy ideas they come up with. And, well, then at least, these 16 kids are having fun, and we're at the limits of what we can do. But what happened was that the kids had crazy good fun. They talked to their friends. Their friends are like, oh, I want to go do something like that too. So now their friends are talking to their parents, just like, Mom, Dad, can I do the thing? Can I go and join the Beavers? That sounds like they're having a lot of fun over there. So then you get people coming in the door, and it's like, okay, well, I would love to let you in. And if you're willing to put on a red shirt, I can absolutely put you at the front of the line.
Sure.
And, I don't like resorting to that method, but then equally, our past group commissioner was someone that I brought on board that way. A lot of the scouters that we still have kind of came on board under that handshake agreement. And it did allow the group to, attract a really large core of volunteers really, really rapidly because everybody wanted their kid to be involved. And, so then we could just kind of grow the group kind of almost explosively outward from that. But I think it began with us just saying, okay, well, here's our limit, and we know we have it. But within that limit, we're still just going all out.
Well, let me come in on that, if that's okay, Ken. I 2 things. First of all, let me acknowledge my point on ratio, and we should just say, well, there's, we'll set it at the minimum in my scouts, and you should just have to accept them, is naive and needs thought, right? So I visited a group in, where was it? I forgot, Labrador City, of which there was only the one group, and there's quite a transient population, right? Because a lot are fly in, fly out for oil type work and stuff like that. And their point was, okay, look, we've got ratio on paper, but that's relying on these people turning up every week reliably, and that's really difficult. So like, I've been slightly simplistic in how I articulate it. But saying that, one of the groups that I saw in Nova Scotia, who after COVID just said, we're outdoors now. We're never going back indoors. We are just always outdoors. And they then started playing with a model where, I think it was Beavers, Cubs and Scouts met at the same time in the same place. And they got parents to run, basically it become very base orientated. Like there was people running what I saw was a mobile climbing wall. And then I saw there was a robotics coding type station in a tent. Another one was cycling proficiency and sort of cycle mechanics and upkeep. And they had about, 8 of these. And what they did, I thought was really clever was, I think they had more. I think they had about 10. And basically, you turn up for about 4 weeks, and these were the same bases that we're on, but you moved the patrols through them. So what you ended up with is, you only had to plan one program for 4 weeks. They were almost bite-sized micro-volunteer opportunities. You got parents and carers saying like, I'm a mechanic, I can totally do this. If you just want me to do this, I can do this. Or I work in a coding environment or whatever, right? I cook, I do crafts, I'm from another country. Like there's all sorts of skills you can tap into if you make the micro-volunteering opportunity accessible enough. And so, that was a really high quality program, and it spoke to all sorts of the Canadian path elements, badge work, and loads of it was parent delivered. And so there is something about innovating the format, like that thing of we're going out. And to your point, the group that talked about going outdoors permanently and the sections meeting at the same time, they said, like you mentioned, is they suddenly became very visible to the community. Suddenly They weren't tucked away in the back of a school. Everyone could see it happening. And that group grew during COVID. They never declined. They just grew. So for sure, there's something about thinking about innovating around formats and things like that we should do more of.
Yeah. And there's an idea that's percolated 2 or 3 times in my head, and you just reminded it to me again is that, and this is a message that, I've given to parents and even to the other scouters and to the youth as well. Bring yourself to the program.
Mm.
You know, who are you? What are you? Bring yourself to the program.
I love that.
Because, and I mean, there's lots of, I often have this discussion in like the context of some of the ancillary badges that can be earned. Like, I had a few scouts one year that all wanted to get the religion and life badge. Cool. But that, or the language strip, right? Oh, okay. You speak Mandarin at home. Oh, okay. You speak Spanish at home. Cool. Those are like really particular examples of how you can bring some part of yourself into the program. And hey, we have a badge for that. But more broadly speaking, just bring yourself to the program. And you're right. Like, the parent volunteers or maybe the scouters have all of these other competencies that exist outside of wearing a red shirt. Well, why not use that where possible, right? You have a leader who's a chef. Cool. We're doing a cooking thing. You have a leader who's, whatever the technical term is for a person who researches bugs. Cool. Hey, here's an ant farm, just bring yourself to the program. And that does seem to be like a real path to program success at any rate. And program success, at least in my experience of it, then seems to equate to recruitment success. So more people want to join when they see that this is working.
The route to growth is a quality program. Like, of course, we do and should do work to try and create new provision in communities and, create the infrastructure for it to have a place to go to. But growth is all about program quality. If you've got a great program, then word of mouth will happen, more young people will come, and more young people will stay. And I think more people will volunteer because you volunteer, you want to have fun, you want to enjoy it, you want to see that it's having an impact. Interestingly, if I was to look back to our conversation about early year scouting, one of the things that was an unpredicted success was that in the UK there is a program called the Young Leader Scheme, which is just a much more structured way of 14 to 17-year-olds going and volunteering in the younger sections, which I know we do. We just don't have much scaffolding around it. Interestingly, Squirrels, the young leaders that went and volunteered in Squirrels said, I can see their development happening before my eyes, because that's what happens in the early years, right? The developmental progress is on steroids.
It is.
It's that exponential curve at the start. And I think that's the same for people who volunteer. They want to see that, oh my God, that kid was, wouldn't say boo to a goose at the start of the year, and now they're leading the campfire song. Like that sort of gratification is. But I mean, to your point of tapping, I love that phrase of bring yourself to the program. There's something in that. One of my ambitions for a much stronger foundation for digital transformation is it would start to play with concepts like that and put the right tools behind it. So I left the UK before I could ever try and get something started on this, but I'm convinced there must be a way of somehow brokering the skill sets within your parents and carers in your section at any given time and the program. Like, how could you make it really easy for a millennial generation to go, right, I'm confident in cooking, in car mechanics, in computer coding, and the volunteer to be able to go, right, that is 4 nights of my program, 3 nights of my program.
Done.
I'm just going to slot you into, like, we'd have to do a bit of thinking around how do you make sure they don't have to do sort of 4 hours of respecting sport, but there is the right guardrails around that interaction, etc. But you could do that in a digital context. It's what I hear people longing for when people sort of lament the removal of areas. That's often what is behind it, is it just feels too difficult now to find other volunteers who can help with more sophisticated program and the collaboration on a geographical level that allows this more impressive, edgy, adventurous program to happen, because you've got access to people with that sort of knowledge and confidence. I think there is something that digital tools should speak to make that easier.
Yeah. I mean, like on that, talking about like knowing who to contact, right? And that's, I think, another place where like bring yourself to the program really works. And, just to pick the 2 examples that I used earlier, right? When the Beaver Scouts wanted to talk to an astronaut, well, okay, it is really hard to actually get airtime with a NASA astronaut because there's all sorts of agreements. But in a roundabout sort of way, I did actually happen to have some contact with a former game developer who had paid his own ride to space and had spent a few days on the International Space Station and was a big proponent of private space companies, SpaceX and Blue Origin and all the rest of them, right? And I, just happened to have his email, so I sent him an email and just like, would you come talk to the group? And he was like so stoked. And then also separately, when the Beavers are like, well, I want to design a board game. Okay, I have no idea how to do that, but somebody knew somebody at BioWare, the game developer that's headquartered here in Edmonton. And they were like, well, BioWare still, like, when they're building games, they still template a lot of the systems as like pen and paper tabletop games.
For sure.
That's how they test it.
That's how user design works, yeah.
Yeah. So somebody there might know, I think, do you know anybody there? And he's like, I can email somebody. And they sent us 3 guys who just came and sat down with a room full of beavers and gave them a little 10-minute like dissection of what is a game. And then we turned them loose. And it was, so that's, the other side of bring yourself to the programs. Who do you know? You know people. Who are they?
Well, we just need to make that easier. Because again, that like what you're describing is brilliant, but it takes confidence and network and time, right? I mean, one of the, if I was to look it back to where we started on the conversation to program, and some people will definitely hate this and call me a sellout at this point, right? One of the second order reasons for a badge framework is that you can then have really interesting conversations with potential partners, be that corporate or charitable. And look, I make no apologies to say that when we're now at something like 80% reliance on membership fees, we've got to find a way to diversify our income. And corporate sponsorship, to me, is something we don't tap into enough. But a more exciting mission reason to do that is that if you form these paid-for partnerships, paid for or not, then you start getting into interesting conversations about access to their employees or access to their estate. So the UK has got a much more developed partnership offering, and actually a lot of it's based on the fact that you can sponsor a badge, right? That becomes an instantly interesting hook, right? Of which we can't do as much here because there's not a badge framework in the same sort of merit badge-esque way. Yeah. But that results in things like partnerships with Warhammer, where every group got sent
you had that
in their group. Partnerships with the likes of Raspberry Pi, where actually a coding kit got sent out to everyone. Partnerships with the likes of even things like supermarkets. So there was one with a sort of an equivalent of Walmart, and Cubs could go in and they called it Farm to Fork, where you basically got explained the sort of how does the food get to your plate. Nice. Like, again, a brilliant like whole evening program on a plate. They had a partnership with HSBC that developed a whole series of money skills activities.
Jeez.
All non-formal education, none of it sort of like chalk and talk, like all really well thought through. How do you have fun with explaining money to a beaver, which is what I think they've gone down to squirrels now. Like all these partnerships give us opportunities to say, can we give an offering to local volunteers that says, look, you can book to go into your local Walmart, or you can book to go to your local Air Force base, or whatever that looks like. Or we're going to be sending you kits on this cool program activity. I think we've got to do better on that. And so selfishly, the return of a more specific badge framework would, I think, make those sorts of partnerships much easier to broker.
Yeah, well, and it gets back to your point about like taking the homework away from the time-strapped volunteers, yes. Because most of what you've described is stuff that I can think of our group as having done. I mean, we don't have an Air Force base anywhere nearby, but everything else is stuff that we've done over the years. But it's only because, I know the manager at the local grocery store,
sure.
Or, I know the manager at the bank over there. Like it's, somebody knows somebody and they're willing to extend that olive branch and set something up that then we can take part in. And that's really, really great when you have a lot of people who know a lot of people. But yeah, like, your point, you want to take a lot of that homework and networking and approach anxiety away from the volunteers. So having them sort of that nice pre-packaged thing with, say, nationally Walmart or nationally TD Bank or whatever that you can just hand them and be just like, hey, here's a thing you can do. That would be a really great thing to have. Anyway, I do need to hang it up because work beckons, but I do have to say thank you so much for your time.
Not at all. Anytime, Ken. Thank you for having me on, and best of luck with the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you out there for listening. And until next time, be prepared.